Hello everyone, my name is Liz Nelson and I work for the Tax Justice Network, and I coordinate our work linking tax justice with human rights issues. Got a very exciting panel today, and in the next, I think, hour and 10 minutes or 20 minutes, and there'll be plenty of time, I hope, for questions. Before I start and hand over to our first speaker, just a kind of few words. When I was thinking about the panel and read some of the work by Laura and Jacqueline and Rose, I was looking at different articles, and I just stumbled. In fact, came across my email which I didn't know. I don't know how many of you know that Monday was International Civil Aviation Day. And the Secretary General of the United Nations made this kind of statement, or certainly this was given the headline: aviation is an important engine of our world and will play a critical role in lifting the world to recover from COVID-19. Now, to be fair to Secretary General Guterres, he went on to explain there are a huge amount of complications with that, and the use of fossil fuels and the impact on communities, on indigenous people, the short change that women who are often most affected by climate and fossil fuel use and extraction. So it's a more complicated story, but I mean, just the highlight of that certainly made my blood run cold, and I thought, is that there must be some more nuance in this. And I think our three speakers today are going to actually help us understand better not only just the kind of underbelly of private and public kind of partnership and working together, but also, what are the progressive policies that we can move to? Can there be a just transition? Can it be fair? Is it going to be all inclusive when we look at a green economy? So we're going to look at three different areas. We've got with us today Laura Merrill, who's an economist and policy advisor, and Laura's you're going to talk about fossil fuel subsidies and taxation, and I hope unpack for us a little bit about what happens when we take those fossil fuel subsidies away. We've also got with us Jacqueline Cottrell, and Jacqueline works on environmental fiscal policy as a consultant and specializing in green budgeting and inclusive green economy. And I'm interested that Jacqueline, I think, is going to talk about the kind of design of carbon taxes and how they can be progressive, and how some of the communities and the people who are really the losers currently. I mean, we're all losers, but there are particular parts of our communities and low-income communities that particularly are put under duress and trauma as a result of it. So what's the deal for them? And then finally, we've got Rose Bridger, who's the co-founder of Global Anti-Aerotropolis movement, and Rose has written a kind of both a book and a number of papers, and I would really encourage you to go to her website to look at what are both the Aerotropolis concept, the idea, and the kind of devastation that actually affects people immediately in that Aerotropolis, but also the communities around that. So I'm probably going to leave it there, and as I say, we're going to have quite a lot of time for questions. So I'm going to hand over to Laura first, and then we'll go to Jacqueline and then to Rose. So over to you, Laura. Thank you.
Very much. I'm going to try and share my screen. Hopefully this will work. No, am I? Okay.
It's starting to share.
Is it?
Yeah, yeah.
Jolly good. So hopefully that's working now. Great. So I want to just say a huge thank you to the Tax Justice Network and the opportunity to share some words around subsidies. John mentioned many articles that have been published by the TJN on this link between taxes and subsidies and climate change, including one from me on fossil fuel subsidies. And I'm going to focus on those now. And just to mention that these are subsidies that governments and taxpayers are paying for. To subsidize and to fund fossil fuels every single year from the existing resources that we have. And it was interesting to hear about the debt from Peter, but from our existing resources, we're still paying for fossil fuels every year. So I'm just going to start with a quick health warning, because fossil fuel subsidies can seriously damage your health in very obvious ways. They're bad for the planet, for your health, and for government budgets. An image of how particular matter can impact your body. And this picture of a little girl called Ella Kisser-Deborah, who died from an acute asthma attack in 2013 and lived very close to London's South Circular Road, a notorious pollution hotspot. Pollution linked to diesel fumes from diesel vehicles and fuels that were subsidised for many years by governments across the EU. One study found from T&E that this was to the tune of €2,600 for every new diesel vehicle. So they really do have a very human impact, and they can damage your health. But they also damage your health in not so obvious ways. They abbreviate to FFS, they require lots of acronyms, and you spend a lot of time talking about definitions and scale, what a subsidy is, what it's not, and I'm going to try to get to this point right at the beginning. So definitions of scale. Here we're going to start with a mince pie, and I apologize for people not celebrating Christmas, but this is a traditional mince pie. And we imagine that this represents the fossil fuel subsidies to consumers, and it swings between around $500 to $200 billion annually, depending on the price of oil. Right now in 2020, the estimate for consumer fossil fuel subsidies is $181 billion because of the low oil price. But the fossil fuel subsidies, they increase when the international oil price goes up. So in 2012, when the oil price was very high, these subsidies were $566 billion. Because importing countries, they have to subsidize the price of oil to a greater extent to keep the price low to consumers. And that's a direct transfer of government funds. And that subsidy is based on a price gap methodology. It's recognized by many, many countries via the WTO. So now we add in a chocolate truffle, and we will say that this represents the producer subsidies, and they've been estimated in the past about $100 billion. A more recent estimate for producer subsidies in the G20 was 70 billion. So it's about right. And this is all the upstream subsidies recognized by the WTO, incentives, tax breaks, cheap loans, benefits that encourage state-owned and fossil fuel companies to dig and drill for fossil fuels. And finally, we add in $5.2 trillion of subsidies, but this is represented by a very, very large Christmas cake, as it's understood by economists and the IMF as the cost to society of fossil fuels. This is the gap between what we pay for fossil fuels and what we ought to pay. And this figure of 5.2 trillion includes that price gap subsidy plus the cost of climate change and air pollution. It's the true cost, it's the externalities. And this cake is about double the size of a normal Christmas cake, a lot larger still compared to 2020. But this cake represents the potential for taxation of fossil fuels based on carbon and so on. It's got huge potential to raise revenue for governments, to fund the climate transition and the economic crisis, to pay for safety nets. It's a big cake that many governments are not taxing, and they're not eating at all. But I am going to focus on the subsidies, the mince pie and the truffle. Jacqueline will come back to the taxes and why governments are shelling out so much year on year with real taxpayers' money, and why this needs to stop. So to bring it back down to something that looks like a webinar graph, here we go. This is EU consumption and production subsidies combined, totaled over, they made around 125 billion US dollars between 2014 and 2016, or around 55 billion euros per year. So this is a problem that, you know, EU governments might say these subsidies don't exist anymore, but they do exist, and they're being paid out every single year from existing revenues. This for other people in perhaps in other countries, just to show the largest fossil fuel subsidies in 2019 expressed by value, but compared here by the percentage GDP spent subsidizing fossil fuels to the scale of those countries' COVID response measures. So that was up in July this year. The measures might have increased, but for some countries like Egypt, Iran, Saudi and India, you can see that the scale of fossil fuel subsidies is sort of more than or on a par with the scale of government response to COVID-19. So the other thing to say is these subsidies at a national level, they take up big, significant space in government budgets. So reforming and removing them frees up resources that could be spent on transforming our energy systems, paying for the social cost of pandemics, anything you really want to spend it on. The other point about reforming subsidies, as well as providing more fiscal space for governments, but there's an associated reduction in emissions. Globally, we reviewed at the Global Subsidies Initiative 60 papers and found it to be around between 6 to 8% reduction in emissions by 2050 from the removal of fossil fuel subsidies alone. And then we did selective country modeling and found an average of around 6% reductions in emission from removal of subsidies. In this graph, that's the green section at the top. This is the average across 26 countries we modeled, followed by further emissions reductions when you recycle 30% of the savings from the subsidies and you put them into renewables and energy efficiency. And I'd like to say in this model, we also modeled for 50% of the savings to go into social safety nets to cover the cost of any increases in energy pricing. So the point being that money and resources, they're fungible, and you don't need to do either or social security or investment in the climate transition. You can do both. And so the idea is that the subsidy is shifted away from fossil fuels and towards people and green energy. The model then demonstrates further emissions reductions when you add in a modest tax of 10% on fossils. So you remove the subsidies, you recycle the funds to green energy and safety nets, you introduce a modest tax, and in total we found 13% emissions reduction against business as usual. So it's basically a swap, or you're shifting away from governments putting money into fossil fuels and putting it into people and green energy. But there are some important caveats to this, and I think other speakers have mentioned this before. Any change in price and energy prices will go up with taxes and potentially with subsidy reform, depending on if you do it in a low oil price, but it needs to be delivered very carefully. Inflation's an issue. And many countries offered free electricity or gas to consumers in March of April this year to try and manage the living costs of the first lockdown. So this needs to be thought about and handled very carefully. The second thing to mention is that producer subsidies need to go. These are all the upstream subsidies to oil and gas companies, often within developed country government finances. For example, G20 fossil fuel subsidies total were 150 billion annually, and over half of these were to producers. So it's to pay for all the upstream drilling. A very important point is the reforms or taxes, they need to be accompanied hand in hand with social safety nets, strengthening these or starting these to deliver them to the poor. If they're not done properly with safety nets and in a phased manner, things can go very wrong. We've written, there is articles here on France and Ecuador. But it can be done. Subsidizing energy based on fossil fuels subsidies can be shifted towards pushing in targeted social safety nets, delivering cash transfers based on need and on positive outcomes, and on transforming energy systems. In other words, you can do both. You can build back better. And I think that there are also now more subsidies to businesses, blanket subsidies linked to COVID-19. And there are very few strings attached, I mean, particularly for aviation. And again, those subsidies ought to have you know, strings attached to help move us forward on this green transition. Very finally, yes, this is finally, in short, taxpayers' money is going to massive subsidies to fossil fuels from existing resources, forget about the debt, year on year, and governments are actively paying to damage our health, to damage our planet, and they're selling out their government budgets, our taxpayers' monies like this, and basically it could be spent better elsewhere. And I end also with a quote from UN Secretary General. Liz mentioned about aviation, but he also understands that there's a call on governments to phase out all these fossil fuel subsidies with clear time-bound targets and plans. That's what's lacking. And he calls to governments to make more fiscal changes, including putting a price on carbon, phasing out the fossil fuel finance, which is another great whack of funding on top that's not subsidies, but is sort of soft loans and things like this that sort of doubles the scale of this problem, and ending the fossil fuel subsidies and then shifting this tax burden from income to carbon and from taxpayers to polluters. And the point being that IMF thinking about that Christmas cake back there was 5.2 trillion of what we could be taxing or paying to make this transition happen. Economists, the response to COVID was 9 trillion, you know, and to fund the transition, I think people at Stanford worked out it was 73 trillion. It seems like a lot of money, but it's only 14 Christmas cakes, and it can be done. It will pay for itself. It can be done through getting rid of subsidies, putting in taxes, getting bonds and debt finance there as well. But it's totally achievable, and it all needs to change. So I will stop sharing my screen somehow. Here we go. I think I've ended that. Is that screen share ended?
Yeah,
great.
It has.
Okay, that's it.
It's you done. That's brilliant. Thank you, Laura. And you know, it's like it is, even though I mean this is a bigger and longer term picture around sustainability and resilience, it's kind of helpful to have that kind of metric and to frame it around COVID, because it gives you a very immediate sense of the scales that we're talking about and the change that we can make, and which is important. Now, just before we go on to Jacqueline, I probably should have mentioned at the beginning, there is a Q&A function at the bottom. I'm sure most of you have seen it, but if you've got questions, please put them in there, and I'll kind of moderate those when we get to the question point. So Jacqueline, I'm going to hand straight over to you. And I think you have some slides as well, don't you?
I do. I will try and share them.
Okay.
Now.
Looks like you're on the way. Yeah.
Okay, if you can you see my slides now? That's fine.
We can, yeah.
Great. Okay, wonderful. So I'm afraid, thank you very much, Laura, I don't have any Christmas cakes in my slide. I'm not feeling that Christmassy yet, but it's really leads nicely into my presentation. I think what Laura said, really thinking about this two sides of a single coin. And what I wanted to talk about a bit today, given the very short time, I only have a very few slides because we want lots of time for the discussion and questions, obviously. So this is based on a blog I also wrote for the Tax Justice Network, which talks about myth-busting and mainstreaming carbon taxes. Because very often it's simply taken for granted that carbon taxes and carbon pricing is regressive. They have regressive impacts as a matter of course, and actually the reality is rather more complex than that. We have to look at exactly what the impacts are of specific carbon energy taxes, what they're targeting, whether you can design them in a way that can be progressive. And if we look at certain sectors, we can see certainly that if we were thinking about aviation, there's a lot of potential there to create quite a progressive tax, which is geared towards taxing greenhouse gas emissions. And we can see that there's been quite a lot of research done in low and middle income countries, for example, on taxing the transport sector, and there the impacts are less clear. But this isn't to call into question the fact that that can sometimes be the case, but simply to say, to bust that myth that it's we have to be really clear and to understand what these impacts will be. So first of all, I just wanted to show a slide which really just to highlight the inequity of climate impacts. Oh, sorry, no, I've clicked on. To make clear that limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees C compared to 2 degrees C can reduce the number of people exposed to climate-related risks and susceptible to poverty by up to several hundred million. What we're looking at here is really a huge justice issue. Climate change is about inequality. It's about injustice, and I think we have to be very, very clear that we need, obviously, a just transition, but we must not lose sight of the fact that the poorest people in the world already are being and will continue to be the most affected by the climate emergency. The more dependent on ecosystems, the more dependent on natural resources, the more exposed to climate change impacts. And of course, they're less able to respond to climate disasters because they simply don't have the means to do so. What I'd like to show on this second slide is some statistics from Piketty and Lucas Chancel, which they developed in the run-up actually to the 2015 Paris Climate Conference, which shows the geographical distribution of global emitters of CO2. And I think more interestingly, it shows the very high concentrations of emissions for just a few emitters. So if you can see on the left-hand side, the top 10% of emitters worldwide emit around 45% of total global CO2 emissions. So if we can think of clever instruments that really target that top 10% of emitters with a high carbon price, and we think about how to do that well, then you're looking at a carbon price that can really start to have an element of a Robin Hood tax in it. And if we don't implement something to put a price on the carbon that this 10% of emitters are emitting, then we are really looking at a huge injustice. We're not making these polluters pay. We're not implementing the polluter pays principle, one of the underlying principles of environmental policy. And as you can see on the graph on the right-hand side, the much smaller one, the bottom 50% of emitters are emitting about 13% of global CO2 emissions. So we also need to be clear where this burden will be and how it will be distributed. If we can think about getting this top 10% of emitters and thinking about looking at big emitters, that's a really big step towards climate justice. I'd like to move on to the next slide and talk a bit about negative equity impacts. What we can see is in countries with per capita incomes of less than 15,000 US dollars annually, carbon pricing actually has a progressive distributional effect. So this is the income effect done for a tax of about $30 per ton of CO2. And it's looking at the impact on the lowest income group relative to the national average. Values lower than 1 indicate progressive outcomes. So what that means is the countries where the color is green are countries where you're looking at a progressive distributional effect as a result of a carbon tax. Now, this isn't to say that there won't be a change in the income of the smallest group and that we don't need to think about how, therefore, to ensure that any changes to household income of the lowest income groups are compensated for through redistribution mechanisms, whatever they may be. But it's simply to say that overall the impact is progressive. And as you can see here in very many low middle income countries that were modeled for this study, we can see that there's this progressive impact. And what I think another thing that it's important to think about when we're talking about carbon pricing and we're thinking about whether there may be regressive impacts or not is to really think about the potentials that we have to raise revenue by implementing carbon taxes and carbon pricing. So we were talking today earlier on thinking about whether you could raise sufficient revenue from carbon taxes to actually fund the transition, and whether or not that's the case, we can see that there's potential here to use the revenue for example, for redistributive purposes, and so for some of it to be reinvested into renewable energy, for example, or energy efficiency, as Laura was talking about before. And we can see here, this shows the potential carbon revenues in some middle income countries from a carbon price of $70 per tonne CO2. So that's a lot higher than the carbon price that was modelled on the last slide. But we can see here that in some countries, you're looking at 3.5% of GDP. Now, if some of these countries have very low tax to GDP ratios, this can really significantly boost their tax take. And what I'm not arguing for in this particular case would be to implement at once this kind of carbon tax, but to do that over many years, of course, and to start at a much lower rate. But nevertheless, what this slide illustrates is that there's a potential there to raise a substantial amount of revenue from the tax and to really make a significant difference to the revenue that's collected by a particular government. And if you're looking at a tax rate of this size, you're dwarfing health budgets as they are currently, you're dwarfing the welfare budgets in these countries, and you're really raising enough revenue to make a very big difference to how the country is governed and how the budget works and how it functions. So finally, on this last slide, I'd like to show the revenues that were raised from 2015 to 2019 from carbon pricing. We can see here that in 2019, $45 billion were raised. That's from about 22% of global greenhouse gas emissions that are actually covered by a carbon price. So we can see that we've got another 78% of emissions which aren't yet under a carbon price at all, where we can think about introducing a price, perhaps at a very low rate. We can see here that only 5% of emissions are priced at levels consistent with reaching the targets of the Paris Agreement. So there's definitely room for improvement amongst these 22% of emissions, but as well, there's a lot of room for improvement with new taxes and new carbon pricing schemes that can be introduced. And we can see here that, that there's a lot of potential there to raise a substantial amount of revenue. So the question is, I think perhaps what I haven't touched on yet is the reason why there hasn't been any kind of agreement on a global carbon tax as yet, and why there might not be one for quite some time. I think one of the issues is a concern about inequitable impact and how to address those. My contention would be that we can address that with policy, with good policy design, with thinking about the right kind of redistributive mechanism, and I hope we can talk about that more in the Q&A. And of course, we also need to think about a dimension of inequity that I haven't mentioned yet, and that's inequity of representation in policy making. We can see that there's a lot of interest groups who have a huge amount of interest in the status quo. We can see that there's oil and mining companies, fossil fuel companies, energy intensive industry, wealthy consumers. There's a lot of influence out there which isn't pushing in the direction that it should be, whereas an awful lot of the voices of the people who are going to be hardest hit by climate change are really not being put into the debate, which is why it was so great to hear all the presentations earlier on, the first presenter talking about exactly these issues, how to get these voices in to be heard. But I think it's really important that that changes and that we bring this discussion much more into the mainstream. And we need to talk about, when we're talking about bringing it into the mainstream, not only about the what, we need to tackle climate change, but really about the how. We need to have a carbon price. We just need to design it well so that it can create the signals that we need to shift our country towards a more low carbon development, towards a greener development, while at the same time mitigating negative impacts and setting real price signals that will bring about the change. Okay, I'd like to stop there. I'm going to stop my share. Hopefully that will work, and pass back to you, Liz.
Jacqueline, thank you. That was great, and really interesting to hear about. And maybe these conversations will come out about the kind of governance of these policies and the design of the policies, and also the redistributive impact. Maybe we'll get some questions about that. But before we do, and so we've got similar time for Rose, I'm going to hand over to you, Rose. I can't remember if you'd got some slides you wanted to share with us, but.
Hello. Yes, I've got some slides I'll be sharing shortly.
Okay, so, I'll just hand over to you then.
Thank you. Firstly, thank you very much to the Chaps Justice Network for organising this amazing conference. And here we are in the final days of 2020, an unusual year for aviation, firstly acting as a vortex spreading coronavirus worldwide, and then air traffic plummeted, planes parked in the desert and airports largely deserted. But governments around the world stepped in to increase support for the sector. We've seen massive bailouts to airlines. By October, the sum had reached about 100 billion, and that's climbing upwards, and also substantial sums to airports. And this has happened even though poverty is increasingly alarmingly during the pandemic, and even though aviation is well known to the benefits predominantly accrue to the wealthy. The vast majority of the world's population has never taken a flight. A recent study indicated that 1% of the global population accounts for about half of the emissions from aviation, a small minority of hypermobile, hyperpolluting frequent flyers. The airlines bailout, it's not the first time, there's precedent for it. Enormous sums were allocated worldwide in the aftermath of the 2008 financial crisis. And there's several instances of ongoing serial bailouts and ongoing subsidies, such as direct support for particular routes. Aviation subsidies, arguably, are effectively oil subsidies, because aviation is the most fossil fuel intensive, climate damaging form of transport. And you'd think that in the COVID era, with the vulnerabilities of aviation dependency all too evident, aviation expansion would have halted, but this is not the case. Many projects have continued, they're being expedited, allocation of public funds is continuing, and also land acquisition. And this, I'll try and share slides now. Is that slide share okay? Oh,
yes, it is. I can.
Oh, yeah. Great. Okay. I'll start with, this is a map of global airport-related social environmental conflicts, and it's the dimension of what Suzanne was talking about in her keynote speech, which is most of these projects, the conflict arises because people are being evicted from their homes and farmland. And there's also vast destruction of forests and other ecosystems. Many of the projects aren't just airports, they're Aerotropolis or airport city developments, airports surrounded by commercial and industrial development that's designed to be aviation dependent. We're familiar with many of the tax breaks for aviation, such as on jet fuel, many on VAT and the associated duty-free shopping. And these Aerotropolis projects are often associated with a new generation of special economic zones, which are characterised by tax breaks and other subsidies. And I'll briefly look at just a few examples. This is the area in Indonesia, aerial imagery of an fertile farmland and villages allocated for Kertajati Airport and Aero City, with various zones allocated to industry and tourism. I'll add a map of the project and I'll rotate it to align with the baseline imagery and digitize the boundary and remove the map, which will actually give an indication of the area affected. And the rectangular area here is the area allocated for the airport, and the surrounding areas, the total area is about 50 square kilometres for the various zones of the Aero City. By 2016, residents of 10 villages had been forcibly evicted from their homes and farmland. And then in November, I'll highlight another village, Sukamulya, an 11th village within the airport area. In November 2016, villages assembled, attempted to prevent officers entering to measure land for the airport project. There was a brutal police response. Villages were tear gassed. There were several people beaten and injured, and people were also detained. Another example, in the Philippines, tax breaks have been approved for food and infrastructure conglomerate SMC to build and operate an aerotropolis in Bulacan. The 10-year tax exemption includes things we'll be familiar with, such as excise taxes, stamp duties, customs, etc. And this is just one of many protests, mainly because thousands of fisher folk will be evicted from their fishing grounds. Another model, this is the Eastern Economic Corridor project in Thailand. It spans 3 provinces with a range of infrastructure projects. The priority project is expansion of Utapao Airport to be an aerotropolis. The incentives include 13-year corporate income tax exemption, a bonfire of regulations, with about 100 laws and regulations being amended or suspended. A lot of concern about the 99-year land leases, and protests by networks of citizens groups who are concerned about being excluded, about lack of transparency, and warning of massive land grabs. In the US, the Detroit Aerotropolis, it's multiple sites of vacant land available for commercial and industrial use, actually spread out around 2 airports. And here's just an indication of the comprehensive range of tax breaks that are available regarding industrial facilities, personal property tax, and the 100% relief on property taxes. And I'll also mention Amazon in the USA. With COVID quarantine, there's been tremendous growth in home delivery, and this has aided an accelerated expansion of Amazon distribution centres and warehouses, many of which are adjacent to airports and many of which have enormous tax breaks. For example, this one in Kentucky and Cincinnati received at least 40 million in tax incentives for an air cargo hub. And this map shows that there's actually an area allocated for future expansion. So I'll conclude with those examples and try and stop my slide share. Yeah, so to conclude with these few examples, I think regarding aviation expansion, I think this indicates the scale of the opportunity here, that if we stop aviation expansion and if we stop the subsidies, there's a tremendous potential to utilise financial and physical resources to benefit communities and protect the climate.
Rose, thank you so much. Actually, one of the things that you're talking about, the kind of expansion and the kind of subsidies and the destruction around a particular area and attendant communities, reminds me very much of the kind of parallel in Caribbean small island economies, which people see as the big cruise ships going there, but actually there's very little stimulated economy that comes out of that. So it's kind of just an interesting kind of parallel. We've got quite a few questions, so we've got a little bit less time than I expected for questions. So I'm going to suggest we go into those fairly quickly. And I think they've moved around a little bit. The first question the first question, yeah, from Katie Galogi Swan is, and a couple of people have up-thumbed that, or whatever the expression is, and maybe that's something, Jacqueline, you'd like to answer. The question is, earning around 25k per year puts you in the top 1% of incomes worldwide. On this income in the UK, a family would not be wealthy by any matter of means. I think there's a real challenge to talk about making polluters pay. If we extend this to the top 10% worldwide, obviously we need to push our governments to decarbonising, so this isn't the case to this end. So how do we build that north-south solidarity on this without it falling greatest on the already squeezed households in the north?
Okay, so thank you very much for the question. I think I'd like to say two things about that. I think, first of all, if you're talking about environmental taxes, one thing that I think is really important to know is that they are easy to get around in a way. If you can reduce your pollution, then you don't have to pay them. So we're making polluters pay. We're not making everybody pay for the transition, but you're having a focus on the polluter paying. And that's a very established principle in environmental law and environmental policy. So I would argue in the first place that there are many choices that households can make, which can mean that they can, if you like, evade a particular tax, or at least avoid it by changing their behaviour. As well, I think what's really important to think about in this context is very progressive taxes. So for example, we've been talking about aviation. So you could have a tax on aviation, which allows one flight per year, say, at a relatively low tax rate, the tax rate that we have now on flights in the UK. But you can look at increasing that for frequent flyers. So if people are flying very, very regularly, then they're paying a much higher rate of tax. And then you're also hitting those big polluters harder. So I think there are ways of implementing the polluter pays principle which are legitimate and can be progressive. Aside from that, on the question of building solidarity, I think there's not an easy answer to this part of the question. How do we build this solidarity? I think part of it is that countries, for example, in the European Union and other high-income countries, need to show that they're much more sincere about taking steps to tackle climate change. And I think we probably all have a lot of hope that the conference in Glasgow next December will really show that commitment and will really begin to show that the high-income countries are prepared to take a hit. And finally, sorry, just one more point. I did show the kind of revenues that we can raise by taxing carbon. We can use this revenue to protect squeezed households in the north. That would be something that I would argue would be a very important part of a large carbon tax, is that you can raise a substantial amount of revenue, that you can use that revenue to protect vulnerable households. Okay, I'll finish there.
Thanks, Jacqueline. I mean, I don't know, Laura, if you wanted to add to that. There are a number of questions for you around subsidies. So maybe if I feel free to comment on the last one, but let me just put a couple of questions to you. One is, can you say a little bit more about what form the subsidies take, and what is a consumer subsidy and a producer subsidy? How do you distinguish those? And then a next couple of questions from Reinhard Huss is, why does Laura propose a targeted social security net rather than a universal social security? His experience being with targeted social security and social services. One, it gives enormous power to state bureaucrats to decide about the deserving and the undeserving poor, and special health services for the poor, and poor services in contrast to universal health services. So kind of why do you sort of take that distinction as well?
So I think I'll start with that first question, and it
Yeah.
kind of links back to the one that Jacqueline answered about, progressiveness and social safety nets. I mean, the main reason is because some countries don't have any safety nets. And so, I mean, I'm all for living in an ideal world with a universal healthcare system and a universal social security net and child welfare payments for everybody. And for being fair and to having a good system that works. But and I've worked in Bangladesh and other developing countries, and basically it's not there, it doesn't exist. And so the point is, if you're going to start to build a social security system, you've probably got to start with targeting at people who need the most help first. And that is actually what's happening with COVID, and also for subsidy reforms, because governments know that prices of fuels will go up. They have to put in place a way of getting money to people to make life affordable, and they've done this in many countries where they can get cash to set up a system that delivers cash instead of cheap fossil fuels. And that's the thrust of it. You're shifting from providing cheap gasoline, cheap diesel, cheap gas, kerosene, getting off that, and rather targeting money to people who need it most, not middle class and not upper class, really poor people who want to get access to these fuels, and either giving them vouchers or cash, and trying to remove it from attaching it to the fuel, which creates lots of rent seeking around fossil fuels and gives the money to big companies and state-owned enterprises, and rather giving it to individuals. So I think we're on the same, I'm not in disagreement. I think the aim is for universal health and education and social safety nets. The thing is just the base of where people are starting from. But India is a really good example of how they've managed to shift a fossil fuel subsidy that was delivered through gas, but to get it much better targeted to people and families who don't have access to gas already, but also to de-link it from the fuel itself. So you buy the fuel with your own money, and then you get compensated with money into your bank account. So you also have to have a bank account, which gets more people into the financial system as well, so that people can get money from the state to help them in difficulties if needed. So I find that very interesting. The fact that countries have to do reform pushes them to create social safety nets, which is good. And COVID has done the same. COVID has had to governments have had to strengthen their safety nets and put them in place where they don't exist, to get money out to people in this difficult pandemic. So, and then very quickly on producer and consumer subsidies are to consumers, and producer subsidies are upstream to producers, to gas and oil companies who drill and extract oil. And it's like tax breaks and write-downs and easier regulation and free training of oil drillers, and concessions on land rights, and all of this, all these benefits that governments can confer on these producers upstream to make life easier and cheaper to drill oil than, say, I don't know, to chop wood or to put up a renewable energy farm. It's just giving them a conferred advantage, all these kind of breaks. So those are the producer subsidies, and they're often very hidden and difficult to get hold of. The consumer ones are maybe like you get a reduction in your bill, but that will be as a result of money having been given to an electricity company or a gas company or a petrol company, so that they can then provide that in turn. Or it might be a tax. They're supposed to pay the carbon tax, but they've been given an exemption because they're like, I don't know, cement producers, and they're really important to the economy. So it can also be a tax that's foregone. just to add on for Rose, I mean, the subsidies in the airline industry that exist already, you're absolutely right. They're completely mammoth. I mean, before COVID, there's some really interesting work from Transport and Environment that finds that basically flights are subsidized to such an extent that it's almost like governments are actually paying for you to fly, because the cost of the flight is so cheap. The subsidies are so massive. There are more subsidies going in to keeping the whole thing going than consumers are actually paying for the flight. And I'll send you that information afterwards. But yeah.
Did you want to add anything, Rose, on that?
Well, yeah, regarding subsidies for aviation, I do think that I think you referred to the actual route subsidies as something that are really worth looking at, because it's been going on for a long time, and it, happens, through various different mechanisms. And I think that's something that now would be the time to actually do something about it. And I think also, I think in terms of solidarity and network building, becoming more aware, as with Suzanne's talk at the beginning, of how people are actually impacted by these infrastructure projects. Because when a new airport is being built, often for tourism in a poorer area, it's for inbound tourism, for luxury tourism. The most marginal people are being evicted for infrastructure that is benefiting, the wealthiest elite. And we're seeing an increase in sort of aviation dependent resorts for the ultra high net worth individuals, and now that's all coming in with an increase in private jet sales, partly because it's COVID safe, which is kind of ironic. So I think listening to the testimony and having that international networking is a really good way of building solidarity.
Thanks, Rose. Yeah. Jacqueline, we've got a question here for you from Brian Gifford. Brian's asking, what happens to public finances when carbon prices have their desired effect and carbon is used less, so there is nothing left to tax? i.e. the positive impact on public finances is transitional. What happens after?
First of all, we are delighted that we no longer have to pay carbon taxes because we've had the desired effect. But on a more serious note, obviously people have spent a lot of time thinking about this. The first thing that you can do to keep the revenue relatively stable in the medium term, let's say, is to introduce a tax escalator. So while emissions are falling, you've got a tax price that's ratcheting up to compensate for that. So that's something that governments can do in the medium term to ensure that the revenue remains at a certain level. I think in the long term, what we have to say is that some things are pretty sure in life, and that is that governments will find something to tax. And I think there are plenty of alternative tax bases out there that we can explore as we move forward towards a low carbon society. I think we can see as well that there are very strong arguments for taxing energy, for example, so that consumers do use it efficiently. And I think that's just one example of many. So although I understand the concern, and it is something that governments often express, I think it's more of a long-term problem than a short-term one. And we can see that in that time, we will have time to develop a concept on what we are going to tax in the future. For example, electric car batteries. Sorry, yes, please.
Can I just come in on the back of that, Jacqueline, because I totally agree. I see this question come up a lot, and it's an interesting question, and it's but we're a long way from that yet. I mean, if we look at the figures, I mean, you said there was 45 billion in carbon tax revenue that has been raised in 2019. We're talking 500 billion in subsidies that are being given by governments positively to encourage fossil fuel use and extraction, or then you've got this. It's like a negative price on carbon. It's working in the opposite direction, and many countries don't have not just a carbon tax but just a basic VAT a basic VAT on fuel. And now I know that sounds crazy to people who might live in the UK, where there's very high levels of VAT on fuel and a fuel tax that helps to provide for health services. But in the aviation sector, fuel is completely untaxed. And in many other countries, there's not the same level of tax. If you look in the US, it's very undertaxed compared to the damage that these fuels are doing in terms of pollution, but also what could be raised, either a carbon tax or a VAT to fund this stuff. So it's a nice academic argument to think about, well, what happens when we can't tax oil and gas, but there's many countries that to me, it seems like a long way off from where the reality that we're at the moment.
Thanks both. There's a question here, and maybe it has a UK focus, but I think it's probably more, it has a wider relevance, and maybe I'll direct it at you, Laura, first. Do we first need to establish a definition of fossil fuel subsidies? And that the UK government, a fossil fuel subsidy definition that the UK government will accept and admit to? And what are the avenues for the public and civil society to then push government to stop or reform fossil fuel subsidies? So kind of could it be our advocacy around that? And to what extent do trade rules offer an opportunity to talk about fossil fuel subsidies?
Going to try and be quick, but this is quite a long question with like 3 different parts, and I'm really sorry if I confuse people with like the whole mince pie thing at the beginning. But basically there is a definition of what a subsidy is, and it's been agreed at the WTO by lots of countries internationally, and there are moments of arbitration where countries, they take each other to the WTO. Heaven knows it may happen to the UK in the future as well. It has probably happened, and they say, look, you can't do this because you're conferring a massive subsidy on a certain industry. And basically countries haven't done that to one another on fossil fuels ever, really. Very, very rarely, because everybody's doing it. They're all subsidizing the fuel. So if one of them starts, it's never going to end. But the definition in the WTO is very broad. It not only includes these direct revenues, but also benefits that are conferred and tax breaks. And I think I sort of expressed that before. And you can't really change the definition to fit the UK. There's a definition, it's at the WTO, and that's what you're going to have to deal with as a subsidy. And it's about making people aware that this is a subsidy and then thinking about how to deal with it. I think ODI have done good campaigning work in this area, Oil Change International as well as the Global Subsidies Initiative. And there are papers, I can try and find them in the chat, that Vivid Economics have done looking at that gas subsidies and things like this. So yeah, it's I don't know how to answer that question. And using trade rules, that I kind of gave a hint of it, but it's a very long process to start using trade rules to take countries to court over fossil fuel subsidies, as it were, to the arbitration. And nobody's really done that yet. There are a few countries that have come together to try and agree to get rid of the subsidies within their trade agreements. New Zealand, Costa Rica, Liechtenstein, and Switzerland, I think. But that's called ACTS, and that was launched last year. But this is a long way off, I think.
Great, thanks. I wonder if either Rose or Jacqueline had any thoughts about the kind of second part of that question about the avenues for public and civil society to push government to stop reform on fossil fuel subsidies.
I can say a few words on that.
Great.
I think one thing that it's very helpful, at least when civil society is communicating about fossil fuel subsidies, because they're so big. If you get that information in the public domain and you compare it, for example, to the amount of, for how many nurses that could hire, for example, in terms of the COVID crisis, seeing it in that perspective, you know, to really make it clear how big these fossil fuel subsidies are and how unjustified. There's been some work done in Scotland on exploration subsidies in the North Sea. And I think that just simply putting in the public domain the real scale of it, whether that be with mince pies and Christmas cakes, but, you know, or showing how many wind farms could we build, how many turbines could we build instead of subsidizing oil and gas in the North Sea. And if you put it in those very stark terms, that kind of communication strategy, I think, can be quite helpful to make it clearer, at least to governments, and to make it clearer to a wider audience that this isn't some kind of niche topic. This is something that we should really all be interested in, because it's a huge amount of wasteful spending, and all countries at the moment are really under pressure. They need to think carefully about how they spend their money, and fossil fuel subsidies is not a good way to spend it. So I think that communication aspect is really important, and making the scale clear.
Yeah, what I'd like to say totally follows onto that, which is an aspect of upstream fossil fuel subsidies, which is that some of the biggest airport projects in Asia and Africa are specifically for delivery of heavy equipment and also workers in the early stages of development of fossil fuel projects. For example, and there's a lot of, you know, global north investment going into the global south, for example, Mozambique LNG and the oil refinery project and pipeline project with an associated airport in Uganda. So I think you know, that there's a very high level of public funding from the global north going into that, and I think that's something we need to raise awareness of.
Thanks, Rose. And probably I could have asked this question on the back of the other one, but because it kind of relates to the point around, I think, advocacy. But Declan Owens is asking, it appears that there needs to be a transnational agreement on tax policy and law, which he says he understands will be difficult, especially outside the EU. However, do you agree that this may require citizens, trade unions and other progressive groups going on a tax strike to force the issue? Is that the way forward? Jacqueline, do you want to?
I'm very happy to comment on that as the first person. I work on taxes all the time. I talk about taxes a lot, tax policy and law. So I think it's quite tricky for me to argue in favour of a tax strike. That isn't to say that other groups couldn't do it to put pressure on government, but certainly that my position would be that I'm always arguing in favour of people paying their taxes. I'm arguing that taxes are the price that we pay for a civilised society and that we need to make them better. I think there are routes to getting something like an international agreement on tax policy. One of them might be Glasgow next year. There's a lot of discussion in Article 6 of the Paris Agreement about carbon pricing. It might be that there's potential within that to come to some kind of agreement. The IMF's also pushing for the biggest emitters in the G20 to come together and agree a carbon pricing regime amongst themselves, and that will cover about 80% of all greenhouse gas emissions actually worldwide. There's also work at the UN on carbon taxation within the Environmental Taxation Committee, and there might be a possibility through the UN route to come to something like an agreement on an international carbon tax. So I think there are possibilities in the coming months and years for steps to be taken in the right direction, and for there to become, if not some kind of harmonisation, perhaps a minimum price amongst G20 countries at first. I think that may be feasible as a first step, and perhaps some other high-income countries involved in that as well. So that would be the line that I would take.
Rose, do you have a?
Well, no, this is all very new to me. I know very little about all these possibilities for international agreement on tax policy and law, and I really want to find out more about it. But just on first impression, the idea of a tax strike, I don't really like, because even though, you know, little people paying too much taxes, and I feel it's important to kind of hold the line and uphold the principle. That would be my first thought on the issue. Even though there's so many egregious injustices in the tax system, my instinct would be to not to strike, but it's not something I've heard about before.
Okay, great. So let's get 2 or 3 more questions in if we can, and I'll ask 2 questions on top of one another. How do we prevent fossil fuel companies from just passing their carbon tax to the consumer? And then, is it by making higher gas prices, for example? And then the second question, that was from Ashvin Sharma. And the next question from John Nightingale: what if some countries levy producer taxes and some not, or less? Will this mean that the fuel of the latter countries can sell at a lower price and therefore be more attractive to buyers in a competitive market? So there's a kind of producer's question and a consumer question. Jacqueline, do you want to? Sorry, Rose, I saw your mic just a moment off there. If you wanted to go first, or yeah, okay.
No,
Jacqueline.
I'm just absorbing information at the moment.
Great. Okay, Jacqueline, do you want to?
Okay, yeah, sure. So I'll go first on this one. On the first question about passing their carbon tax to the consumer, there will be a pass through if you levy a carbon tax, for example, upstream at the top of the value chain. That is what will happen. That's part of the indirect tax. You put the tax on the price of the fuel, and depending on the market, that may well be passed on to the consumer further down. I think it depends what you tax, and one reason that you implement an environmental tax or a carbon tax is that it can disincentivize a certain kind of behavior, for example. So if you really tax at the well, it would mean that some extraction would no longer be economically viable, for example. So one thing that you can do with a tax is, rather than passing it on to the consumer, you change the amount that is extracted. What you can see in the United Kingdom is that we introduced this carbon floor price in our electricity system, and you could see there that really pushed an awful lot of coal-fired power stations out of the market altogether, because it simply was no longer economically viable to use coal to generate electricity. So there'll be one of those 2 impacts. There'll either be an impact that will really change extraction, or there may be one, if you tax a fossil fuel company, that they pass that on to the consumer, and the price incentive is then at the end of the chain, if you like, to introduce energy efficiency measures or to drive less, depending on the fuel in question. So that's how it would work in terms of the consumer. The second question was about in a sense, it's about the distortions that you get if some countries levy producer taxes and some countries do not. And we do see that internationally, that there are these distortions in the market. It's an undesirable situation as we have it now, and it's something that countries are concerned about. And that kind of goes back to the question that we discussed earlier. This is one reason to aspire to having an international carbon price, or at least over a certain number of countries, so that you can avoid those kind of distortions and those decisions being made.
Thanks. And Laura, do you have any thoughts to add about that issue of countries levying producer taxes for some and not for others, and the distortions that Jacqueline was talking about?
I'd first like to just come back to this issue about labour and tax, and just because it's quite important when it comes to reforms, because it's like tax, it's about a change usually a change in price of energy, and usually an increase, not always, but usually, and it really is important that people understand that it's not, you've got to do these reforms properly. And I think we saw in I think it was at the end of 2018 in France with the Gilets jaunes, and this was kicked off with an increase in higher gas prices, and the problem And the problem was it wasn't done with, and it was also, there was going to be an increase of gasoline and diesel and on gas and electricity as well. And the problem was that this wasn't done with any dialogue with the unions, with society beforehand. It wasn't really thought through well. And there needs to be that consultation beforehand with unions to understand, well, what's going to work here, what won't, and how do we protect people who are in poorer sections of society, or people in the trucking industry and transport industry, or people living in rural areas who have to use their car because there are no bus services and this kind of thing. And so I think this is it, where you got to reforming subsidies or putting in any kind of tax on energy. You've got to have that social dialogue beforehand with unions and with others, and you've got to have it with these social safety nets that are increased, that citizens can see, look, I'm going to be asked to pay more here, but I'm getting this back here, and they can clearly see the link and around social safety net. So I think it's a really important point that was raised within this question, and it's not, I don't know if a tax strike is the way to force these things through, but certainly where there is the political will to do it, there has to be this dialogue so that it doesn't go in the opposite direction. And then on the producer subsidies, I mean, I'm not quite sure I clearly understand the question, but I think that's the idea, that, you know, you offer subsidies to encourage organizations to come and drill here, just like there might be tax subsidies and tax breaks in other countries to encourage businesses to go there. And that is basically a race to the bottom. And so and deregulation in a way, because you might offer those breaks by having less rules and regulations and protections and that sort of thing. So I think that probably is at the heart of it, but there has to be some way of like everybody moving together, and that just hasn't really happened with the subsidies, because there hasn't been a kind of mechanism to really stop people from doing this. So that's the gist of it. That's why people do it, to create the incentives to get the market.
Laura, thanks very much. I've very poorly moderated the last part of this session because we've run out of time, and we did have some more questions, but we will have a look through those and see if we can answer them. I mean, it's been I've been learning a lot, both before the session and during the session, about the complexity of the design and the reform that's needed. And you know, as advocates as well, we have our work cut out. It really leaves me to thank Laura, Jacqueline, Rose for your contributions. They've been fabulous and fascinating.